In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind lace curtains, a jar of marmalade sparks a chilling mystery. Professor Hargreaves, a reclusive chemist, vanishes without a trace. His revolutionary marmalade formula worth millions stolen. Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting needles and razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of greed. A nervous grocer's boy, a housekeeper with a guilty secret, a polished businessman with a dark agenda, and a scarred stranger lurking in the shadows. But when a mysterious jar appears at the village fête, its amber glow hiding a deadly truth, Miss Marple discovers the professor's fate lies not in the formula but in a hidden cellar where a single whisper could unravel everything. Who stole the recipe, and what are they hiding in plain sight? Chapter 1 Asterisk. The village whispering the drowsy heart of St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with late summer roses, and the air carried the faint hum of bees. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The pale pink wool in her hands was destined to become a shawl for the vicar's wife. Though Miss Marple's mind was far from the neat stitches, her eyes, bright and sharp behind her spectacles, drifted to the window where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden. It was a day like any other in the village until Mrs. Dolly Bantry burst through the door, her cheeks flushed and her hat slightly askew. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, clutching her handbag as if it were a lifeline. "You'll never believe what's happened. It's Professor Hargreaves, he's vanished." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "Vanished," she repeated, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. "The chemist from Willow Cottage, the very one." Mrs. Bantry plopped into an armchair, fanning herself with a handkerchief. "Gone, Jane, without a trace. And that's not the half of it. His marmalade formula, the one he's been fussing over for years, has disappeared with him. The village is positively buzzing, and the police haven't a clue." Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. A missing man and a stolen formula. This was no ordinary village gossip, but something far more tantalizing. She set her knitting aside and leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the quiet excitement of a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Tell me everything, Dolly," she said. "From the beginning." Mrs. Bantry, never one to resist a tale, launched into the details with gusto. Professor Cyril Hargreaves, a retired chemist who had taken up residence in Willow Cottage 3 years prior, was an eccentric figure in St. Mary Mead. A wiry man with a shock of white hair and a penchant for bow ties. He had arrived with little fanfare, his past a vague tapestry of academic achievements and chemical patents. The villagers, accustomed to their predictable routines, had initially regarded him as an oddity, a man more at home with test tubes than teacups. But Hargreaves had won their affection, or at least their curiosity, with his peculiar obsession. "Marmalade, not just any marmalade," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He claimed it was revolutionary. A formula, Jane, that could make oranges sing. He said it would put St. Mary Mead on the map. Imagine, our little village, famous for preserves." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the implications. "And when was he last seen?" 3 days ago, Mrs. Bantry replied. "Mrs. Finch, his housekeeper, says he was in his study, as usual, surrounded by jars and papers. She went to market, and when she returned, he was gone. The door was unlocked, the study in disarray, and not a soul in sight. The police found no sign of a struggle, but there was a broken jar on the floor labeled Formula X, of all things." "Formula X," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of her chair. Curious, and the police constable Reed. I presume, oh yes, poor Reed's out of his depth. He's been poking about the cottage, asking questions, but you know how he is more suited to lost cats than missing chemists. He says it could be anything. Hargreaves wandered off, or he's been kidnapped, or worse. But I say it's that Marmalade formula. Someone wanted it badly enough to make him disappear. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the garden, where a black bird hopped along the stone path. People, she thought, were not so different from birds flitting about, hiding their true intentions behind bright feathers. And what do the villagers say? She asked. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of gossip. Oh, Jane, it's a proper scandal. Old Mrs. Phipps swears she saw a stranger lurking near Willow Cottage 2 nights ago. Man with a scarred cheek, dressed in a heavy coat, far too warm for August. Then there's Tom Bailey, the grocer's boy, who's been delivering oranges to Hargreaves every morning. He's been acting shifty, they say, avoiding questions, and don't get me started on Mrs. Finchie's been jumpier than a cat in a thunderstorm. Some reckon she knows more than she's letting on. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alight with possibilities. A stranger, a nervous boy, a secretive housekeeper, each a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. And has anyone else been seen with the professor recently? Visitors, perhaps. Mrs. Bantry's brow furrowed. Now that you mention it, there was a man from London, Mr. Vance, Leonard Vance, a businessman, all polish and charm, stayed at the Blue Boar in last week. He called on Hargreaves twice, something about a business proposition. The vicar overheard them talking at the inn, and he said it sounded heated, something about untapped potential and millions. Millions, Miss Marple echoed softly. A dangerous word, Dolly. It makes people do the most extraordinary things. Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. Exactly. And now, with the village fête coming up, everyone's talking about the marmalade competition. Hargreaves was supposed to enter his special batch this year. If that formula's out there, Jane, someone might try to pass it off as their own. Wouldn't that be the cheek of it? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Indeed it would. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. Human nature, Dolly, is a curious thing. It hides in plain sight, behind smiles and teacups and jars of marmalade. Mrs. Bantry sighed, settling back in her chair. You'll look into it, won't you, Jane? You've a knack for these things. If anyone can find Hargreaves and his blessed formula, it's you. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. I shall keep my eyes open, Dolly. That's all I ever do. As Mrs. Bantry bustled out, promising to return with any fresh gossip, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Willow Cottage. She had passed it countless times on her walks, noting its ivy-clad walls and the faint glow of lamplight from the study window late at night. Professor Hargreaves was a man of precision, not prone to wandering off without a word. A broken jar, a missing formula, a stranger in the shadows. These were not random threads, but part of a pattern. And patterns, Miss Marple knew, always revealed themselves to those who looked closely. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and stepped into the garden. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses. St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and gossiping tongues, was a microcosm of the world, a place where secrets nestled in the most ordinary corners. She strolled toward the village green, her pace unhurried but purposeful. The grocer's shop, where Tom Bailey worked, was her first stop. Young men, she had observed, often saw more than they realized, their eyes catching details their tongues hesitated to share. The shop was a hive of activity, with villagers stocking up for the fête. Tom Bailey stood behind the counter, his lanky frame hunched as he weighed apples for Mrs. Phipps. His eyes flicked nervously toward Miss Marple as she entered, her presence as unassuming as a sparrow. She selected a tin of biscuits and approached the counter, her smile warm but her gaze piercing. "Good afternoon, Tom," she said. "Busy day, I see." "Yes, ma'am," Tom mumbled, his fingers fumbling with the till. "Lots to do with the fête and all. I imagine you've been run off your feet, delivering to Professor Hargreaves," Miss Marple said lightly. "He was particular about his oranges, wasn't he?" Tom's cheeks reddened. "Oh, Seville oranges, every morning. Had to be just right, or he'd send M back." Miss Marple nodded, as if merely making conversation. "It must be strange, not delivering to Willow Cottage now. When did you last see the professor?" Tom hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. 3 days ago, ma'am. Dropped off the oranges as usual. He was in his study, scribbling away. Didn't say much, just took the crate and shut the door. Nothing unusual then." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her question hung in the air like a hook. Tom shifted his weight. "Well, there was a man, ma'am. Not from here. Saw him outside the cottage that morning, hanging about the gate. Didn't like the look of him, scar on his face, like he'd been in a scrap." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind catalogued the detail. A scarred stranger, just as Mrs. Phipps had mentioned. "How interesting," she said. "And did this man speak to the professor?" "Not that I saw," Tom said quickly. "I didn't stay long. Had other deliveries, you see." "Of course," Miss Marple said, paying for her biscuits. "You've been most helpful, Tom." As she left the shop, her mind turned over the boy's words. Tom was nervous, but was it guilt or merely the unease of youth under scrutiny? The stranger intrigued her Marmalade, out of place in St. Mary Mead, lingering near a cottage where a chemist had vanished. She made a mental note to inquire about this scarred figure, perhaps through the ever-watchful Mrs. Phipps. Her next stop was the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. Leonard Vance had stayed. The inn, with its low beams and polished brass, was a hub of village chatter. The landlord, Mr. Higgs, greeted her with a nod, accustomed to her occasional visits for a glass of sherry and a quiet observation of the clientele. Today, the bar was quiet, save for a group of farmers discussing the harvest. Miss Marple settled at a corner table, her eyes scanning the room for any trace of the mysterious Mr. Vance. "Mr. Higgs," she said as the landlord brought her sherry, "I hear you had a guest from London recently. A Mr. Vance." Higgs nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Miss Marple, smart fellow, all suits and smiles. Stayed a week, left yesterday. Said he was here on business, something to do with Professor Hargreaves." "Did he mention the nature of this business?" Miss Marple asked, sipping her sherry. "Not in so many words," Higgs said, "but he was keen on the professor's marmalade, of all things. Kept asking about it, how it was made, whether Hargreaves had any partners. Seemed mighty interested for a man who claimed to be in imports." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her glass. Imports, indeed. Men like Vance, she thought, often cloaked ambition in vague terms. And did he meet with the professor often? "Twice, to my knowledge," Higgs said. "Once at the cottage, and once here, in the private parlour. I heard raised voices, but I don't pry," you understand." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You've a business to run." As she finished her sherry, her thoughts turned to Vance. A businessman with an eye on marmalade was unusual, but not implausible. Gourmet preserves were a growing market, and a unique formula could indeed be worth millions, as Mrs. Bantry had said. But why the urgency? And why had Vance left so soon after Hargreaves' disappearance? Miss Marple stepped out into the evening air, the village now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. She walked past Willow Cottage, pausing to study its darkened windows. The garden gate creaked faintly in the breeze, and she noted the overgrown path leading to the shed. Something about the cottage felt wrong, as if it held its breath, waiting for its secrets to be uncovered. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered: Tom's nervous glances, the scarred stranger, Mrs. Finch's odd behavior, Vance's heated meetings, and that broken jar labeled Formula X. She closed her eyes, letting her mind wander to the villagers she knew so well. Mrs. Finch, for instance, was a woman of routine, yet her jumpiness suggested a disruption. Tom, young and impressionable, might have seen more than he admitted, and Vance's polished exterior likely hid a sharper edge, she thought. Too, of the fête where the marmalade competition would draw every jam maker in the village. If Hargreaves' formula was truly unique, someone might be tempted to use it, perhaps unwittingly revealing themselves. Miss Marple had seen it before: greed and ambition surfacing in the most unexpected places, like a weed in a rose garden. As the fire crackled, she recalled a similar case years ago, when a missing recipe for scones had led to a bitter feud among the Women's Institute. The culprit, a seemingly meek spinster, had been driven by envy, not profit. People, Miss Marple mused, were predictable in their unpredictability. Hargreaves' disappearance was no accident, nor was the theft of his formula. Someone had planned this, someone who knew the value of his work. She rose, fetching a notebook from her desk. In her neat handwriting, she listed the names: Tom Bailey, Mrs. Finch, Mr. Vance, the scarred stranger. Beside each, she jotted a question. What did Tom see? Why is Mrs. Finch afraid? What does Vance want? Who is the stranger? The answers, she knew, lay in the small things: the glances, the hesitations, the stains on an apron tomorrow. She would visit Willow Cottage. Constable Reed might allow her a peek under the guise of neighborly concern. She had a knack for noticing what others missed: the angle of a chair, the dust on a shelf, the scent of oranges lingering where it shouldn't. For now, she returned to her knitting, the pink shawl growing stitch by stitch. The village might whisper, but Miss Marple listened, and in listening, she would find the truth. The clock struck 9, and St. Mary Mead settled into its quiet night. But for Miss Jane Marple, the game had begun, and she would play it to the end. Chapter 2. The curious chemist. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the stone walls and muffling the clatter of milk bottles at cottage doors. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a tweed coat and her sensible scarf, walked with purpose toward Willow Cottage, her umbrella tucked under her arm as a precaution against the unpredictable August sky. The village was awake, but its pulse was slow, the rhythm of a place where secrets simmered beneath the surface of daily routines. Her conversation with Mrs. Bantry the previous day had stirred her curiosity, and the mention of Professor Cyril Hargreaves' disappearance, coupled with the theft of his marmalade formula, had set her mind to work like a loom, weaving threads into a pattern. Willow Cottage stood at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls giving it an air of quiet seclusion. The garden, once meticulously tended, now showed signs of neglectroses drooping under their own weight, a patch of weeds encroaching on the path. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the police tape fluttering across the gate, a stark reminder of the cottage's new status as a crime scene. Constable Reed, a young man with an earnest face and a tendency to blush under scrutiny, stood guard by the door, his helmet slightly askew. "Good morning, Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I thought I might offer my condolences to Mrs. Finch, if she's about. Such a shock for her, poor woman." Reed hesitated, his hand hovering near his notepad. "Well, ma'am, Mrs. Finch isn't here just now. She's been staying with her sister in Netherby. But I suppose there's no harm in you having a look, seeing as you're a neighbour and all. Just don't touch anything, mind?" "Of course not," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling with the innocence of a lamb. She stepped past the tape, her gaze already sweeping the scene with the precision of a hawk. The front door opened into a narrow hall, where the air carried a faint tint of oranges and something sharper, perhaps turpentine or a chemical residue. Miss Marple's nose wrinkled slightly, filing the scent away for later consideration. She followed Reed to the study, where Professor Hargreaves had spent countless hours perfecting his marmalade formula. The room was a chaos of scholarly neglect. Bookshelves sagged under the weight of chemistry journals. A desk was buried beneath papers scribbled with equations, and glass vials littered a side table, some still bearing traces of sticky orange residue. In the center of the floor lay the shattered remains of a jar, its label reading Formula X in bold, precise handwriting. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her eyes tracing the jagged edges of the glass. "This was broken recently, I presume?" she asked, glancing at Reed. "Yes, ma'am," he said, scratching his head. "Found it just like that when we arrived. No fingerprints, though least, none we could lift. The professor's papers are a mess, too. Can't tell if anything's missing, but it looks like someone was in a hurry." Miss Marple nodded, her attention shifting to the desk. Among the scattered notes, she spotted a ledger with entries for orange shipments, Seville, Valencia, even a rare batch from Morocco. The professor's obsession with his marmalade was evident in the meticulous records, dates, quantities, even notes on the fruit's acidity and sugar content. One entry caught her eye: August 1st meeting with L.V. Ree, commercial prospects, declined offer. El Villenard Vance, perhaps. The businessman from London was climbing higher on her list of threads to tug. "Constable," she said, straightening, "have you spoken to anyone who saw the professor the day he vanished?" Reed flipped open his notepad, his brow furrowing. "Well, there's Tom Bailey, the grocer's boy. Delivered oranges that morning, says the professor was his usual self, grumpy but working. Then there's Mrs. Finch, who claims she left for market at 10 and came back at noon to find the place empty. And Mr. Vance, of course, though he's back in London now, says he last saw Hargreaves 2 days before at the Blue Boar, and no one else." Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her question carried weight. "Not that we know of," Reed admitted, "though Mrs. Phipps keeps going on about a stranger with a scar. Could be nothing, she's always seeing things." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Mrs. Phipps sees more than most, Constable. It's the privilege of age and a good window seat." She moved to the window, which overlooked the garden and the shed beyond. The glass was smudged, as if someone had pressed their hands against it, but the smudges were too faint to be useful. Outside, the shed door was slightly ajar, a detail Reed hadn't mentioned. Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate it. Later, perhaps under the guise of admiring the roses, as she turned back to the room, her eyes fell on a small photograph tucked among the books. Younger Hargreaves, standing beside a woman with a bright smile and a basket of oranges. The frame was dusty, but the glass was clean, suggesting it had been handled recently. "Who is this, I wonder?" Miss Marple murmured. Reed shrugged. "No idea, ma'am. Could be family, I suppose. We didn't find much personal letters, no address book." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was racing. A photograph kept close, yet no personal correspondence. Hargreaves was a private man, but even private men left traces of their lives. She thanked Reed and stepped back into the hall, pausing to examine a coat rack by the door. A man's scarf, slightly frayed, hung beside a woman's finches, no doubt, but the scarf's faint scent of pipe tobacco intrigued her. Hargreaves wasn't a smoker, as far as she knew. Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the village in its quiet splendor. Miss Marple lingered by the gate, her eyes scanning the path for any sign of disturbance. A faint imprint in the soft earth caught her attention, a boot print, larger than Tom Bailey's, with a deep tread that suggested weight or haste. She crouched, careful not to disturb it, and noted its direction toward the shed. The police, it seemed, had overlooked the garden in their focus on the house. As she straightened, a figure emerged from the lane. Mrs. Phipps, her shawl wrapped tightly against the morning chill. The old woman's eyes, sharp despite her years, met Miss Marple's with a knowing glint. "Morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Phipps said, her voice carrying the weight of village wisdom. "Snooping about, are we?" "Merely paying my respects," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "You've heard about Professor Hargreaves, I presume?" "Oh, aye," Mrs. Phipps said, leaning on her stick. "And I'll tell you what I told that young constable. I saw a man here, night before last, skulking by the hedge. Scar on his cheek, like he'd been cut with a razor. Not from round here, that's certain." "Did he do anything?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational, but her mind alert. "Just watched the cottage," Mrs. Phipps said. "Stood there for a good 10 minutes, then slipped off toward the woods. I'd wager he's mixed up in this, mark my words." Miss Marple thanked her, promising to pass the information to Reed, though she had no intention of doing so just yet. Mrs. Phipps's observations were valuable, but they needed context. A scarred stranger, a nervous grocer's boy, a housekeeper, absent at a critical moment, and a businessman with an eye for profit. The threads were multiplying, each tugging at the edges of the mystery. She walked slowly back to the village, her mind turning over the details. Hargreaves was no ordinary chemist. His marmalade formula, if as revolutionary as he claimed, could indeed attract trouble. She recalled a conversation at the Women's Institute where Hargreaves had boasted that his blend achieved through a precise balance of citrus oils and a secret chemical stabilizer could preserve flavor indefinitely without losing its zest. Such a formula would be a prize for any preserve company, or even a private collector of culinary curiosities at the post office. She paused to chat with Miss Hartnell, whose penchant for eavesdropping rivaled Mrs. Phipps's. Miss Hartnell, sorting letters with practiced efficiency, was eager to share her own tidbits. That Mr. Vance said, lowering her voice. He sent a telegram to London the day he left. Something about delays unacceptable and secure the asset. I only caught a glimpse, mind, but it sounded urgent. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. How interesting. And did he receive any replies? Not that I saw, Miss Hartnell admitted. But he was on the telephone for ages, shut in the booth. Kept his voice low, but I heard him mention Hargreaves and formula more than once. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind adding Vance's telegram to the growing tapestry. Secure the asset, did he mean the formula, or Hargreaves himself? And what delays had frustrated him? She made her way home, pausing at the churchyard to admire the late-blooming asters. The village fête was 2 days away, and the marmalade competition loomed large in her thoughts. If the formula was still in St. Mary Mead, the fate might flush it out, as pride often led to carelessness. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a small fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The study at Willow Cottage had revealed more than she expected: the broken jar, the ledger, the photograph, the boot print. Each was a clue, but none told the full story. Hargreaves' life, it seemed, was a blend of science and secrecy, much like his Marmalade. She thought of the woman in the photograph, her smile bright against the backdrop of an orange grove. Sister, a wife, a lost love. The absence of personal letters suggested Hargreaves had guarded his past as closely as his formula. She opened her notebook, adding to her list boot print near Shedhu's. Photograph identity, Vance's telegram set. Beside each, she wrote a single word: why? The question was the key, as it always was. Why had Hargreaves vanished? Why was his formula worth stealing? And why had someone, Vance the stranger, or another, gone to such lengths to obtain it? As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a stolen recipe for plum chutney had led to a bitter quarrel at the village fair. The thief, a quiet baker with dreams of grandeur, had betrayed himself by entering the stolen recipe in the competition, unable to resist the lure of acclaim. People, she reflected, were their own worst enemies, their desires leaving footprints as clear as those in the garden mud. Tomorrow she would speak to Mrs. Finch, whose absence from Willow Cottage raised questions of its own. A housekeeper, in Miss Marple's experience, knew more about a household than its owner. Mrs. Finch's jumpiness, as Mrs. Bantry had described, might stem from fear, guilt, or something else entirely. For now, Miss Marple closed her notebook and picked up her knitting, the pale pink shawl growing stitch by stitch. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves was a knot, but she would unravel it, one careful tug at a time. Chapter 3. The grocer's boiler sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green where sparrows darted among the hawthorns. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the late morning light, walked with her usual unhurried grace toward the grocer's shop, a basket swinging lightly on her arm. The air was warm, scented with freshly cut grass and the faint sweetness of ripening apples from the orchards beyond the village. Her visit to Willow Cottage the previous day had sharpened her focus, the broken jar and cryptic ledger entries lingering in her mind like pieces of a half-finished jigsaw. Today, she sought another piece: Tom Bailey, the grocer's boy, whose nervous demeanor and fleeting mention of a scarred stranger had piqued her curiosity. The shop, a squat building with a cheerfully painted sign reading Bailey and Son, was the heart of village commerce. Its windows displayed tins of biscuits, jars of honey, and pyramids of apples polished to a gleam. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled aromas of flour, tea, and citrus, a reminder of Professor Hargreaves' daily orders. Miss Marple stepped through the door, the bell jingling softly, and found Tom behind the counter. His lanky frame hunched over a crate of oranges. His hands moved quickly, sorting the fruit, but his eyes flicked toward her with a wariness that belied his youth. "Good morning, Tom," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as a summer afternoon. "I see you're busy as ever. Those oranges look splendid, Cyril, I presume." Tom's cheeks flushed, and he nodded, his fingers fumbling with an orange that rolled out of reach. "Yes, ma'am. Best ones we've got. The professor always wanted 'em fresh." Miss Marple smiled, selecting a tin of shortbread from a nearby shelf. "You must miss your deliveries to Willow Cottage. It's quite a change, isn't it, with Professor Hargreaves gone?" Tom's hands stilled, and he glanced at the door, as if expecting an interruption. "Aye, ma'am, it's queer, him vanishing like that. Never thought he'd just up and go." She set the tin on the counter, her eyes gentle but unyielding. "You saw him often, didn't you? Every morning, with those oranges. I imagine you noticed things others might miss." Tom shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the counter. "Didn't notice much, ma'am. Just dropped off the crate and left." He was always in his study, muttering about his marmalade. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her next question was precise, like a needle threading silk. "And that morning, the last time you saw him, did anything strike you as unusual? A visitor, perhaps, or something out of place?" Tom's fingers tightened around an orange, and for a moment she thought he might drop it. "Well, there was that man from London, Mr. Vance. I saw him at the cottage a few days before, arguing with the professor. Raised voices, like something about money and the marmalade. I didn't stay to listen, had other deliveries." Arguing, Miss Marple's tone was light, but her mind seized the detail. How interesting, and where were they, exactly? "Out by the garden gate," Tom said, his words tumbling out. Mr. Vance was waving his arms, all red in the face, saying something about a fortune slipping away. The professor just shook his head, told him to leave. "I didn't hear more. Mrs. Finch called me in to set down the oranges." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. Leonard Vance, the polished businessman, seemed to have a temper beneath his tailored suits. "And was that the only visitor you saw recently?" "I hear there was a stranger about, not from the village." Tom's face paled, and he busied himself with the crate, his movements jerky. I don't know about that, ma'am. Mrs. Phipps is always seeing things, isn't she? I just do my job." "Of course," Miss Marple said, paying for the shortbread. "You're a good lad, Tom. But if you remember anything else, you'll tell Constable Reed, won't you? Or perhaps me, if it's easier." Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the counter, and Miss Marple stepped back into the sunlight, her mind turning over the boy's words. His nervousness was palpable, but was it guilt, fear, or simply the unease of a young man caught in a village scandal? The argument between Vance and Hargreaves was a new thread, one that suggested greed or desperation. A fortune slipping A-words that hinted at stakes far higher than a jar of marmalade. She paused by the green, where children played near the duck pond, their laughter a bright counterpoint to her thoughts. Tom had seen Vance at the cottage, but his reluctance to speak of the scarred stranger intrigued her. Mrs. Phipps's sighting, dismissed by Reed as gossip, now carried weight. Miss Marple knew better than to ignore the observations of the elderly. Their windows were the village's eyes, catching what busier folk overlooked. Her next stop was the vicarage, where the Reverend Clement, a mild-mannered man with a fondness for tea and theology, might offer insight. The vicar had mentioned overhearing Vance at the Blue Boar Inn, and Miss Marple hoped to glean more without arousing suspicion. She found him in the garden, pruning roses with a pair of rusty shears. "Miss Marple," he called, waving her over. "A fine morning for a visit. Care for some tea?" "I'd be delighted," she said, settling onto a bench as he called for his housekeeper. Over steaming cups of Darjeeling, she steered the conversation to Hargreaves. "Such a pity about the professor. I hear he had a visitor from London. Recently, Mr. Vance, was it?" The vicar nodded, his brow creasing. "Yes, a curious fellow. I saw him at the inn, talking with Hargreaves in the private parlour. They were discussing the marmalade, of all things. Vance seemed to think it could be a sensation, a revolution in preserves, he called it. Hargreaves wasn't keen though. Said he wasn't interested in money, only perfection." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing the vicar's words. And did they part on good terms? Not entirely, the vicar admitted. Vance was pressing him, saying he'd regret refusing. Hargreaves just laughed, but it was a tense sort of laugh. I felt rather awkward overhearing it. "No doubt," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "And did you notice anyone else with the professor? A stranger, perhaps?" The vicar frowned, setting down his cup. "Not that I recall, though. Now you mention it, I did see a man loitering near the church that same evening, rough-looking, with a mark on his face. I thought he was just passing through, but he seemed to be watching the lane toward Willow Cottage." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Another sighting of the scarred stranger, this time from a reliable source. She thanked the vicar and rose, promising to return for the fate's planning meeting. As she walked back to the village, her thoughts swirled like leaves in a breeze. Vance's argument with Hargreaves, Tom's nervousness, the stranger's presence, these were not isolated incidents, but parts of a larger design. She stopped at the post office to collect her mail, taking the opportunity to probe Miss Hartnell further. The postmistress, ever eager to share, leaned across the counter. "That Tom Bailey's been acting odd, Miss Marple. Dropped a crate of eggs yesterday. All thumbs he was unheard, and I heard him muttering about keeping quiet when he thought no one was listening." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. "Young men do get flustered, don't they? Especially with all this talk of the professor." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Flustered or not, he knows something. Mark my words, that boy's hiding a secret." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched as she opened her notebook. She added Tom's account of the argument and the vicar's confirmation of Vance's ambitions. The scarred stranger appeared again, a shadow moving through the village's edges. She wrote, "Tom saw Vance argue. Scared to speak of stranger. Vicar Vance's pressure. Stranger near church." Beside each, she added, "Motive. The grocer's boy was a small cog in a larger machine, but small cogs could turn great wheels." Tom's fear suggested he had seen more than he admitted, perhaps, something that implicated Vance or the stranger. Miss Marple thought of a similar case years ago, when a delivery boy in St. Mary Mead had witnessed a theft but stayed silent out of loyalty to a friend. Loyalty, fear, or greediness could silence a tongue, but none could hide the truth forever. The village fete loomed, a stage where secrets might slip. If Hargreaves' formula was still in St. Mary Mead, the marmalade competition could draw it into the open. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her mind already planning her next move. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, was due back from Netherby tomorrow. A quiet chat over tea might reveal what lay behind her jumpiness and whether she, too, had seen the scarred stranger. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the pale pink shawl growing stitch by stitch. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves was a tangle, but tangles, she knew, always had a loose end. She would find it, and with it, the truth. Chapter 4. The Housekeeper's Secret. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting neatly folded beside a steaming teapot. St. Mary Mead was stirring, the distant chime of the church bell mingling with the clatter of a milk cart and the cheerful chatter of the events of the past days, the vanished Professor Hargreaves, the shattered jar of Formula X, Tom Bailey's nervous glances, and the shadow of a scarred stranger had woven a web of intrigue that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. Today, her focus turned to Mrs. Finch, the professor's housekeeper, whose reported jumpiness and sudden absence from Willow Cottage suggested a thread worth tugging. Mrs. Finch had returned from her sister's in Netherby late the previous evening, as Miss Hartnell had gleefully reported at the post office. Miss Marple, never one to waste an opportunity, sent a note inviting the housekeeper for tea, framing it as a neighborly gesture to ease the strain of recent events. The invitation was accepted with a curt reply, and at precisely 11 o'clock, Mrs. Finch appeared at the cottage door, her wiry frame clad in a drab brown dress, her eyes darting like a cornered wren's. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said, ushering her into the drawing room with a smile as warm as the sunlight. "How kind of you to come. It must be such a trial, with all this business at Willow Cottage." Mrs. Finch perched on the edge of an armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's been dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin but steady. "The professor gone, the police poking about, it's more than a body can bear." Miss Marple poured tea, the delicate clink of china filling the brief silence. "I can only imagine," she said, passing a cup. "You've worked for Professor Hargreaves for some time, haven't you? You must know him better than most." Mrs. Finch sipped her tea, her fingers trembling slightly. 3 years, ma'am. He was a good employer, kept to himself mostly, always in his study, mixing those potions of his. Marmalade, of all things. Never thought it had come to this." Miss Marple's eyes, soft but piercing, noted the faint orange stain on Mrs. Finch's apron, barely visible beneath her coat. "It's curious, isn't it, how something as simple as marmalade can stir such trouble. Did the professor ever speak of his formula? It seems to have caused quite a stir." Mrs. Finch's cup rattled against its saucer. "He was secretive, ma'am. Locked his study door, even when I was cleaning. But last week, he was different, frantic, like said someone was after his formula, someone who'd stop at nothing, someone." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "Did he give a name, or perhaps a hint?" Mrs. Finch's eyes flicked to the window, as if expecting to see someone lurking beyond the roses. "He didn't say who, not exactly, just muttered about greedy hands and city folk. I thought he was being fanciful, but then he vanished. And that jar was smashed." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the housekeeper's words. Greedy hands, city folk in advance, perhaps, with his London polish and talk of millions. Or the scarred stranger, a figure now mentioned by both Mrs. Phipps and the vicar. She offered Mrs. Finch a scone, her smile disarming. "It must have been a shock, finding the cottage empty. You were at market that morning, I believe." "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Finch said, crumbling the scone without eating it. Left at 10, back by noon. The door was unlocked, which wasn't like him. I called out, but no answer. Just that mess in the study and the broken jar. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the orange stain, a detail that nagged at her. Housekeepers, in her experience, were meticulous, yet this stain suggested carelessness or something else. And nothing else was out of place. No visitors, no odd noises before you left. Mrs. Finch hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Well, there was a knock at the door, just as I was leaving. I didn't answer, had my hands full with the market basket, but I heard the professor open it, and voices. Couldn't make out who, though. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Voices, more than one, perhaps. Just the professor's, I think, Mrs. Finch said, her voice faltering, and another low, like a man's. I didn't stay too. Listen, I wish I had, now. Miss Marple poured more tea, her mind racing. A visitor, just before Mrs. Finch left, could be crucial a link to Hargreaves' final moments in the cottage. Was it Vance, pressing his business deal? The scarred stranger, watching from the shadows? Or someone yet unknown? She steered the conversation to lighter matters, asking about the village fête and Mrs. Finch's plans to enter her own preserves. The housekeeper relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained wary, darting to the door as if she longed to flee. As Mrs. Finch rose to leave, Miss Marple's gaze fell on her coat, where a faint smudge of chalk dust clung to the hem. Curious, she thought there was no chalk at Willow Cottage, but the shed's walls were whitewashed. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Finch," she said. "Do take care, and if you remember anything more, you'll let me know, won't you?" Mrs. Finch nodded, her lips tight, and hurried out. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the quickness of her steps. The housekeeper was afraid, that much was clear, but of what guilt, or the fear of being found out? The orange stain and chalk. Dust were small clues, but small clues, Miss Marple knew, often led to large truths. She walked to the village green, her basket swinging lightly, her thoughts turning to the shed at Willow Cottage. Constable Reed had overlooked it, but Mrs. Finch's chalk dust suggested she had been there recently, perhaps after Hargreaves' disappearance. Miss Marple resolved to visit the cottage again, under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. To the professor's collection. The shed, tucked behind the roses, might hold secrets the house had not revealed at the tea shop. She paused for a scone and a chance to listen to the village chatter. Mrs. Bantry was there, holding court with Miss Hartnell and the vicar's wife, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. "Jane," she called, waving her over. "Any news on our missing chemist?" Miss Marple joined them, her smile demure. "Only whispers, Dolly. But whispers can be telling, don't you think?" Miss Hartnell leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "I heard Mrs. Finch was back, looking like she'd seen a ghost, and that Tom Bailey dropped another crate this morning. Lemons. This time, the boy's a bundle of nerves." The vicar's wife nodded, "And there's talk of that stranger again. Old Mr. Giles saw him near the woods yesterday, carrying a satchel. Said he looked like trouble." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind adding these threads to the tapestry. The scarred stranger, now with a satchel, was a figure of growing interest. She thought of Vance, whose argument with Hargreaves suggested a motive, and Tom, whose fear hinted at knowledge he dared not share. Mrs. Finch, with her stains and hesitations, was a puzzle in herself. Had she seen the stranger, or was she hiding her own involvement? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple opened her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing the morning's findings, Mrs. Finch-Stain, chalked us, heard voices before leaving. Afraid of greedy hands, shed. Stranger satchel, seen near woods. Beside each, she wrote, connection. The professor's frantic state, as described by Mrs. Finch, pointed to a threat. He had sensed a threat tied to his formula, perhaps, or to his refusal to share it. She recalled a case from years past, when a housekeeper in St. Mary Mead had pilfered silver spoons, her guilt betrayed by a nervous tick and a smudge of polish on her sleeve. Mrs. Finch's stains were not silver, polish, but they spoke of carelessness in a woman known for precision. The chalk dust, too, suggested a visit to the shed, perhaps, to hide something, or to retrieve it. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple donned her hat and walked to Willow Cottage, her excuse of a borrowed book tucked under her arm. Constable Reed was absent, replaced by a young officer who waved her through with a nod. She slipped into the garden, her eyes on the shed. The door was still ajar, and a faint scuff mark in the dirt matched the boot print she had seen before. Inside, the shed was cluttered with gardening tools and sacks of fertilizer, but a corner held a stack of crates, one slightly askew. She lifted it gently, revealing a small tin box, locked but dusted with chalk. Her heart quickened. Had Mrs. Finch hidden something here, or had someone else? She left the box untouched, knowing Reed must be informed, but her mind was alight with possibilities. The shed, overlooked by the police, was a stage for secrets, and Mrs. Finch's chalk dust placed her at the scene. Miss Marple returned home, her knitting resumed as the fire crackled. The housekeeper's secret was not yet clear, but it was close, like a shadow moving just beyond the light. Tomorrow, she would watch the village fête, where the Marmalade competition might draw the formula into the open. For now, she added to her notebook, tin box in shed, Mrs. Finch's doing. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves was a knot, but Miss Marple was patient, and patience, she knew, always untied the tightest knots. Chapter 5. The London Connection. The late morning light bathed St. Mary Mead in a soft haze, the village's cobblestones glistening with the remnants of an early shower. Miss Jane Marple, her black umbrella tucked under her arm despite the clearing sky, walked briskly toward the Blue Boar Inn, her mind as sharp as the breeze that rustled the elms. The threads of the mystery surrounding Professor Hargreaves' disappearance were multiplying. Tom Bailey's nervous confession, Mrs. Finch's cryptic fears and chalk-dusted hem, the elusive scarred stranger, and now the tin box in the shed, locked and hinting at secrets yet uncovered. But it was Leonard Vance, the London businessman with his polished charm and heated words, who drew her attention today. His name had surfaced too often in Tom's account, the vicar's overheard conversation and Mrs. Finch's vague mutterings of city folk to be ignored. Miss Marple, under the guise of delivering church pamphlets for the fête, intended to observe him closely, for men like Vance, she knew, often wore their motives like a second skin, visible only to those who looked beyond the surface. The Blue Boar Inn, with its low beams and ivy-framed windows, stood at the village's heart, a place where travellers and locals mingled over pints and gossip. Miss Marple stepped inside, the air warm with the scent of polished wood and baking bread. Mr. Higgs, the landlord, greeted her with a nod, his hands busy polishing a glass. The bar was quiet, save for a pair of farmers discussing the harvest, and a lone figure at a corner table, Leonard Vance himself, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the rustic. His dark hair was slicked back, and his fingers tapped restlessly on a leather notebook, his eyes scanning a newspaper with an intensity that belied casual reading. "Good morning, Mr. Higgs," Miss Marple said, setting her pamphlets on the counter. "I've brought the fate programs for the guests. I hear you've a visitor from London staying, Mr. Vance, isn't it?" Higgs glanced toward the corner, lowering his voice. "Aye, Miss Marple. He's been here a week, though he's keeping to himself, mostly. Asked a lot about Professor Hargreaves. Mind wanted to know his habits, who he saw. Said it was business, but it felt off." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Business can be a broad term, Mr. Higgs. Did he mention what kind?" "Something about gourmet foods," Higgs said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Kept talking about the professor's marmalade, how it could change the market. Seemed mighty keen for a man who claims to deal in imports." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to Vance. His fingers had stilled, but his jaw was tight, as if the newspaper held news he disliked. She approached his table, her pamphlets clutched like a shield, her smile as disarming as a summer breeze. "Mr. Vance, I presume," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Miss Marple from the village. I've brought some programs for the fête quite, an event for St. Mary Mead." Vance looked up, his eyes narrowing briefly before a practiced smile spread across his face. "Miss Marple, a pleasure. Yes, I've heard about the fête. Charming tradition, I'm sure." His voice was smooth, with the clipped precision of a city man, but his fingers twitched, betraying a flicker of unease. "I understand you knew Professor Hargreaves," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair uninvited, her manner as natural, as if they were old friends. "Such a shock, his disappearance. You must have been one of the last to see him." Vance's smile tightened, and he folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "I saw him briefly, yes. We discussed a potential venture, his marmalade, actually. A niche market, you see, for gourmet preserves. But he wasn't interested in commercializing it, more's the pity." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How fascinating. And did you reach an agreement, or was the professor uncooperative?" Vance's fingers brushed the edge of his notebook, a gesture so slight it might have gone unnoticed. "Not quite," he said, his voice clipped. "He was stubborn, wanted to keep his formula private. I respected that, of course, but it was a missed opportunity." "Of course," Miss Marple echoed, her tone gentle but her gaze unyielding. "Though I hear there were raised voices at one of your meetings. Business can be so passionate, can't it?" Vance's eyes flicked to hers, a flash of something, anger, perhaps, or fear before his smile returned. "A misunderstanding, nothing more. Hargreaves was set in his ways. I left it at that and returned to London." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind was alight. Vance's composure was a veneer, and beneath it lay something sharper. She rose, leaving a pamphlet on the table. "Do come to the fête, Mr. Vance. The marmalade competition is always a highlight. One never knows what might turn up." As she stepped back into the bar, she caught Higgs's eye. "Did Mr. Vance receive any visitors here?" she asked her, voice low. Higgs frowned, thinking. "Not visitors, exactly, but he met a man in the parlor yesterday, a rough sort, with a scar on his cheek. Kept their voices down, but I heard Vance say something about securing the deal. Didn't like the look of it, to be honest." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The scarred stranger, again, now linked to Vance. She thanked Higgs and stepped outside, the village bustling with preparations for the fête. Stalls were being erected on the green. and the air carried the scent of baking from the tea shop, where entries for the marmalade competition were already being discussed. She walked slowly, her mind sifting through the morning's findings. Vance's interest in the formula was clear, but his meeting with the scarred man suggested a deeper game. Was the stranger his agent, sent to watch Hargreaves, or worse? And what of the tin box in the shed, dusted with chalk like Mrs. Finch's? The housekeeper's fear and Vance's unease were threads in the same tapestry. But the pattern remained elusive. At the church, Miss Marple paused to speak with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who was arranging flowers for the fête. Such a busy time, Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. I hear Mr. Vance is still in the village. Did he ever mention his plans to you or the vicar? Mrs. Clement snipped a rose stem, her brow creasing. Not directly, but he did ask about the professor's habits, whether he walked alone, who visited him. I thought it odd, but he said it was for a business proposal. He seemed impatient, like he was waiting for something. Miss Marple nodded, adding this to her mental ledger. Vance's questions suggested more than a casual interest. They hinted at surveillance. She thanked Mrs. Clement and continued her walk, pausing at the edge of the green to watch the villagers. Tom Bailey was unloading crates from a cart, his movements still jerky, while Mrs. Finch, now back at Willow Cottage, could be seen through a window, scrubbing a table with unnecessary vigor. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled into her armchair, her notebook open. She wrote, Vance met scarred man, securing the deal. Asked about Hargreaves' habits. Impatient, beside it, she added, plotting. The London connection was growing clearer, but its purpose remained shadowed. Vance's polished exterior masked a man under pressure, and the scarred stranger was no mere passer-by. She thought of a case years ago when a city speculator had swindled a St. Mary Mead farmer out of his land, his charm hiding a ruthless streak. Vance, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, his interest in Marmalade a cover for larger ambitions. The fête, now just a day away, would be a stage for revelations. If the formula surfaced in the competition, it might point to Vance or to someone else entirely. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her knitting untouched as the fire cast flickering shadows. The London connection was a thread she would follow. But carefully, for men like Vance were slippery, and the scarred stranger was a wild card. Tomorrow, she would watch the fate closely, her eyes open for the smallest slipper jar of marmalade, a nervous glance, a trace of chalk dust. The truth, she knew, was never far from the surface, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. Chapter 6. The village-fatted village green of St. Mary Mead was a kaleidoscope of colour and sound, transformed by the annual fête into a bustling tableau of laughter, chatter, and the clink of teacups. Bunting fluttered between the elms. Stalls brimmed with homemade jams and knitted scarves, and children darted through the crowd, clutching sticky toffee apples. The August sun, high and generous, bathed the scene in a golden glow, though a faint breeze carried the promise of evening coolness. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat adorned with a single rose, moved through the throng with her usual quiet grace, her basket swinging lightly on her arm, her eyes bright and unyielding behind her spectacles. Missed nothing, not the nervous twitch of a hand, nor the whispered exchange behind a stall. The fête, she knew, was more than a celebration. It was a stage where secrets, like actors, might step into the light. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves' disappearance had deepened with each passing day. The broken jar of Formula X, Tom Bailey's halting confession, Mrs. Finch's chalk-dusted hem and fearful mutterings, Leonard Vance's tense ambition, and the elusive scarred stranger had woven a tapestry of suspicion that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. The fête, with its marmalade competition, offered a chance to observe the players in this drama perhaps, even to catch a glimpse of the professor's stolen formula in action. She made her way to the jam stall where jars of preserves gleamed, like jewels under a striped canopy, their labels boasting names like Mrs. Phipps's Plum Delight and Miss Hartnell's Gooseberry Glow. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a floral dress and a wide-brimmed hat, was overseeing the stall, her voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. "Jane," she called, waving her over. "You must try the entries before the judging begins, though. I dare say none will match your lemon curd from last year." Miss Marple smiled, accepting a spoon. "You're too kind, Dolly, but I'm more curious about the marmalades today. I hear Professor Hargreaves was to enter his special batch." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Oh yes, and there's a mystery entry that's got everyone talking. Look there, at the end." She pointed to a jar with a simple label, "Hargreaves. Finest." The handwriting was unfamiliar, not the professor's precise script, and the jar itself was unadorned. Unlike the beribboned entries beside it, Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "How extraordinary," she said, lifting the jar to examine it. The marmalade was a rich amber, flecked with fine shreds of peel, its clarity suggesting a master's touch. She dipped her spoon, tasting it carefully. The flavor was a revelation, bright, bitter, yet perfectly balanced, with a depth that lingered. On the palate, it was unmistakably the work of a chemist who understood more than fruit and sugar. "This is no ordinary preserve," she murmured. "Who submitted it, Dolly?" "That's just it," Mrs. Bantry whispered, leaning closer. "It was left anonymously, delivered to the vicarage last night, with a note saying it was for the competition. No name, no address. The vicar's beside himself, but he allowed it, thinking it might be a tribute to Hargreaves." Miss Marple set the jar down, her mind racing. An anonymous entry, bearing the professor's name, yet not his hand. Someone was bold, or foolish, to display the stolen formula so publicly. She scanned the crowd, noting Tom Bailey near the tea tent, his eyes darting nervously as he carried a tray of scones. Mrs. Finch stood by the preserves, her hands twisting her apron, her gaze fixed on the anonymous jar as if it were a spectre. And there, at the edge of the green, was Leonard Vance, his tailored suit out of place among the villagers' Sunday best. He was speaking in low tones to a man Miss Marple hadn't seen before, stranger with a scarred cheek and a heavy coat, his satchel slung over one shoulder. Her eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. The scarred stranger, linked to Vance by Mr. Higgs's account, was no mere bystander. She approached the tea tent, pausing to chat with the vicar, who was judging the baking entries. "Reverend Clement," she said, "this anonymous marmalade is quite a surprise. Have you any clue who might have entered it?" The vicar shook his head, adjusting his spectacles. "None, Miss Marple. The note was typed, no signature. I thought perhaps a friend of the professor's, but it's most irregular. Still, the flavor is remarkably like anything we've tasted before." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the shed at Willow Cottage, where the chalk-dusted tin box lay hidden. Could the formula be inside, or had it already been used to create this marmalade? She thanked the vicar and moved toward the preserves stall, where Mrs. Finch was now arranging jars with a fervor that bordered on agitation. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing. You've seen the anonymous entry, I take it. It's caused quite a stir. Mrs. Finch's hands froze, and a flush crept up her neck. I saw it, ma'am. Queer, isn't it? Someone using the professor's name like that. Almost disrespectful, I'd say. Almost, Miss Marple agreed, her eyes on the housekeeper's apron, where a fresh orange stain joined the faint chalk dust, though it's a fine marmalade. Perhaps someone found the professor's recipe and couldn't resist sharing it. Mrs. Finch's lips tightened, and she turned away, busying herself with a jar of quince jelly. Miss Marple noted the reaction, filing it alongside the housekeeper's earlier fears of greedy hands. She moved on, her gaze drifting to Vance and the scarred stranger, who had now parted ways, the stranger disappearing into the crowd while Vance lingered, his eyes fixed on the jam stall. Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry again, her basket now heavy with pamphlets she hadn't distributed. Dolly, she said quietly, have you noticed Mr. Vance today? He seems rather interested in the marmalade competition. Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze, her brow furrowing. He's been hovering all morning, Jane. And that man he was with, you see the scar, looks like the one Mrs. Phipps described, skulking about Willow Cottage. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. The anonymous jar, Vance's presence, the scarred stranger's satchel all pointed to a scheme that was both bold and reckless. She thought of the ledger at Willow Cottage, with its note about declining Vance's offer, and the tin box, possibly linked to Mrs. Finch. The fête was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead, where ambition and secrecy played out under the guise of festivity. As the vicar announced the marmalade judging, the crowd gathered, their murmurs rising like a tide. Miss Marple stood near the stall, her eyes moving between Tom, Mrs. Finch, and Vance. The vicar tasted each entry, his comments met with cheers or groans, but when he reached Hargreaves' finest, a hush fell. He took a second spoonful, his face registering surprise, then delight. A masterpiece, he declared. Though its anonymity is a puzzle, it's the finest marmalade I've tasted. The crowd erupted in whispers, and Miss Marple caught Vance's expression of flicker, of triumph, quickly masked. Mrs. Finch, meanwhile, turned pale, her hands clutching her apron. Tom, standing nearby, dropped a scone, his eyes wide with something akin to panic. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The formula was here, in that jar, and someone, perhaps more than one, knew, more than they admitted. She slipped away from the stall, her mind alight with possibilities. The fate had revealed a crucial thread. The formula was not only stolen, but in use, displayed with audacity. She recalled a case years ago when a stolen cake recipe had surfaced at a village fair. The thief betrayed by their pride in the prize. Greed, she mused, was a poor keeper of secrets. The scarred stranger's satchel, Vance's interest, Mrs. Finch's stains, and Tom's fear were pieces of a puzzle, and the anonymous jar was the centerpiece. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple opened her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing the day's observations. Anonymous jar, Hargreaves' formula, not his hand. Vance's triumphant look, scarred stranger satchel with Vance. Mrs. Finchpell adjudging Tompanict. Beside each, she wrote, guilty. The fate had been a stage, and the players had performed, their actions betraying more than their words. Tomorrow, she would visit Willow Cottage again, to examine the tin box in the shed. For now, she picked up her knitting, the pale pink shawl growing stitch by stitch. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves was a dance, and the fate had quickened its tempo. Miss Marple would follow the steps, patient and precise, until the music stopped and the truth stood revealed. Chapter 7. A midnight discovery. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its silver light threading through the elms and casting dappled shadows on the quiet lanes. The village slept, its cottages dark, save for the occasional flicker of a late night lamp, but Miss Jane Marple was wide awake. The fate had left her mind abuzz. The anonymous jar of Hargreaves' finest, a bold taunt that confirmed the stolen formula, was not only in St. Mary Mead but flaunted under the noses of its villagers. The players in this mystery: Tom Bailey's nervous fidgets, Mrs. Finch's stained apron and fearful glances, Leonard Vance's triumphant smirk, and the scarred stranger's furtive presence, had danced their parts at the fete, each step revealing more of the pattern Miss Marple was determined to trace. Tonight, under the cover of darkness, she resolved to revisit Willow Cottage, drawn by the chalk-dusted tin box in the shed and a nagging sense that the answers lay closer than the police suspected. She slipped on her dark shawl, its muted hue blending with the night, and tucked a small torch into her basket. Her movements were deliberate, her steps as soft as a cat's, as she left her cottage and followed the lane toward Willow Cottage. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle, and the silence was broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple's heart beat steadily, not with fear but with the quiet thrill of pursuit. She had ventured out at night before, in cases where daylight hid what shadows revealed, and she trusted her instincts to guide her. Willow Cottage loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls ghostly in the moonlight. The police tape had been removed, Constable Reed having declared the scene cleared for lack of evidence, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust hasty conclusions. She slipped through the garden gate, noting its faint creak, and paused to scan the surroundings. The boot print she had seen near the shed was still there, its deep tread undisturbed by the day's foot traffic. Her torch cast a narrow beam, revealing the path to the shed, where the door remained slightly ajar, as if inviting her to uncover its secrets. Inside, the shed was a clutter of gardening tools, sacks of compost, and crates stacked haphazardly. The air was thick with the musty scent of earth and a faint tang of citrus, a reminder of Hargreaves' experiments. Miss Marple moved to the corner where she had found the tin box, its chalk-dusted surface glinting faintly in her torchlight. She knelt, careful not to disturb the surrounding crates, and examined the box more closely. It was small, no larger than a biscuit tin, with a sturdy lock and no visible keyhole scratches suggesting it hadn't been forced. The chalk dust, matching the smudge on Mrs. Finch's hem, was concentrated around the lid, as if someone had handled it in haste. She hesitated, weighing the propriety of tampering with evidence, but curiosity prevailed. Using a hairpin from her basket, she probed the lock, her fingers deft from years of untangling knots, both literal and figurative. The lock clicked softly, and the lid opened to reveal a notebook, its pages yellowed but intact. Miss Marple's breath caught as she lifted it, her torch illuminating the cover, which bore the professor's initials, CH, inside. The pages were a labyrinth of chemical equations, diagrams of citrus molecules, and meticulous notes on marmalade ratios. One entry, dated a week before his disappearance, stood out. Formula X, complete. Perfect balance, achieved. Beware, LV intentions unclear. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. L. Villenard Vance, almost certainly. The professor had sensed danger, his warning scrawled in a hand that betrayed urgency. She turned the pages, finding sketches of oranges and cryptic references to a stabilizer that preserved flavor indefinitely. This was no ordinary recipe, but a scientific triumph worth stealing, worth hiding. She tucked the notebook into her basket, knowing it must reach Constable Reed, but determined to study it first. The tin box, now empty, she left as she found it, relocking it with care. As she stepped back into the garden, a faint rustle from the hedge froze her in place. Her torch flicked off, and she stood motionless, her senses sharp. The sound came. Again a soft crunch of leaves, too deliberate for a fox or badger. She waited, her breath shallow, until a figure emerged from the shadows. The scarred stranger, his heavy coat unmistakable, his satchel slung over one shoulder. He moved toward the shed, his steps cautious but purposeful, unaware of her presence. In the darkness, Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her shawl blending with the night. The stranger paused at the shed door, his hand reaching for the handle, then hesitated, as if sensing something amiss. He glanced around, his scarred cheek catching the moonlight, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, a man on edge, expecting trouble. After a moment, he retreated, slipping back into the woods beyond the cottage, his footsteps fading into silence. She exhaled, her mind racing. The stranger's presence confirmed the shed's importance, but his retreat suggested he hadn't found what he sought or knew it was already gone. She hurried back to her cottage, her steps swift but silent, the notebook a weighty secret in her basket. The village was still, its windows dark, but Miss Marple felt the pulse of the mystery. Quickening, the scarred stranger was no mere observer. He was a player, perhaps hired by Vance, perhaps acting alone at home. She lit a single lamp and opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the professor's precise script. The formula was a marvel, blending chemistry with culinary art, but the warning about LV was the true find. Hargreaves had feared Vance, his refusal to sell the formula a spark that ignited this drama. She thought of the anonymous jar at the fête, its flavor a perfect echo of the professor's work. Someone had the formula, or a copy of it, and the stranger's midnight visit suggested they were still searching for the original dot. Miss Marple opened her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing the night's discovery. Shed tin box, Hargreaves. Notebook, Formula X. Warning, beware, LV scarred, stranger at shed, searching. Vance's agent. Beside each, she wrote, purpose. The stranger's satchel intrigued her. Could it hold another copy of the formula, or something more incriminating? She recalled a case years ago, when a stolen diary had surfaced at a village auction, its thief betrayed by a careless bid. Secrets, she mused, were slippery things, prone to escaping their keepers. The clock struck 1, its chime soft in the quiet cottage. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her knitting untouched as the lamp cast long shadows. Tomorrow she would confront Mrs. Finch again, probing the housekeeper's connection to the shed and the chalk dust. The scarred stranger, too, needed a name, and Vance's role in this web was growing clearer. The fête had been a stage, but the shed was a vault, and its secrets were now in her hands. She rose, securing the notebook in a locked drawer, and glanced out the window. The moon was sinking, the village cloaked in darkness, but Miss Marple's mind was alight. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves was a tapestry of greed and deception, and the midnight discovery had brought her closer to its heart. She would follow the threads, patient and precise, until the pattern stood revealed. Chapter 8. The stranger's shadow, The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle flush of pink, the village stirring under a sky streaked with wisps of cloud. Miss Jane Marple, her sleep curtailed by the previous night's discovery, sat at her breakfast table, a cup of tea cooling beside her, untouched knitting. The notebook from the shed at Willow Cottage, now locked safely in her desk drawer, had confirmed her suspicions. Professor Hargreaves' marmalade formula was no mere recipe, but a prize worth stealing, and his warning about LV pointed squarely at Leonard Vance, the scarred stranger's midnight visit to the shed. His satchel, heavy with unknown purpose, had added a new thread to the tapestry of the mystery. Today, Miss Marple resolved to uncover the stranger's identity, for his shadow loomed large over the disappearance of the professor and his formula. She donned her tweed coat, its muted tones blending with the village's earthy palette, and set out for the Blue Boar Inn where the stranger had been seen with Vance. The lanes were quiet, save for the clatter of a delivery cart and the distant bark of a dog. But Miss Marple's senses were alert, attuned to the smallest detail. Footprint, a glance, a whisper. The fate had revealed the audacity of the thief, with the anonymous jar of Hargreaves' finest flaunting the stolen formula. But the stranger's nocturnal prowling suggested a deeper game, one that tied him to Vance, or perhaps another player yet unseen. At the inn, Mr. Higgs was sweeping the doorstep, his face ruddy from the morning chill. He greeted her with a nod, accustomed to her occasional visits under the guise of church business. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, leaning on his broom. "Come about the fate donations, I reckon." "Something like that," she replied, her smile disarming. "Though I'm also curious about a guest of yours, Mr. Vance, and that man he met yesterday, the one with the scar. Quite a striking figure, I hear." Higgs's brow furrowed, and he lowered his voice. "Aye, a rough sort. Came in yesterday afternoon, sat with Vance in the parlour. Didn't catch his name, but he had a satchel, kept it close like it was gold. They talked low, but I heard Hargreaves and delivery more than once. Left after 10 minutes. Headed toward the station." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained serene. "The station? Did he board a train? Do you know?" Higgs shrugged. "Couldn't say, ma'am, but he's been seen about before Mrs. Phipps. Swears he was near Willow Cottage the night the professor vanished. Gives me the shivers, that one." She thanked him and stepped inside, her basket swinging lightly. The bar was empty, but the private parlour, where Vance and the stranger had met, was open, its table still bearing the faint ring of a glass. Miss Marple paused, noting a scrap of paper tucked beneath a cherry-torn corner of a train ticket, stamped with yesterday's date and the destination London. She slipped it into her basket, her mind turning over the implications. The stranger was mobile, connected to Vance, and possibly carrying something valuable in that satchel. Her next stop was the station, a small platform at the edge of the village where the morning train to London was due. The station master, Mr. Giles, was a grizzled man with a penchant for gossip, and Miss Marple found him polishing the ticket counter. "Good morning, Mr. Giles," she said, her voice warm. "I hear you had an interesting visitor yesterday. Man with a scar, perhaps?" Mr. Giles's eyes lit up, eager to share. "Argy," Miss Marple saw him clear as day, boarding the 4 o'clock to London. Had a satchel, looked heavy. Didn't buy a ticket here, had one already. Returned fare. Seemed in a hurry. Kept looking over his shoulder. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the detail. A return ticket suggested the stranger wasn't leaving for good, but his haste implied urgency. Did he speak to anyone? Mr. Vance, perhaps. Not that I saw, Giles said, though Vance was at the inn, not far off. That scar, though nasty thing, like he'd been in a brawl. Not the sort we get round here. She thanked him and walked back to the village, her thoughts swirling. The stranger was no mere vagrant, but a man with purpose, tied to Vance and possibly to the formula. She recalled the notebook's warning, "Beware, LV," and the anonymous jar at the fête. The stranger's satchel could hold a copy of the formula, or perhaps evidence of Hargreaves' fate. She needed a name, a connection, to pull this thread taut at the post office. Miss Hartnell was sorting letters, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Miss Marple, under the pretense of mailing a parcel, probed gently. "I hear a stranger was seen at the station yesterday, Miss Hartnell. A man with a scar, carrying a satchel. Did he send anything, perhaps?" Miss Hartnell's lips pursed, relishing the chance to share. "He did, Miss Marple. A small package, addressed to a firm in London, Carter and Sons, some fancy food company. Paid for express delivery, didn't say a word otherwise. Looked like he didn't want to be noticed." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Carter and Sons, a gourmet preserve company, known for its high-end jams. The package could be the formula, or a sample of the marmalade, sent to secure a deal. She thanked Miss Hartnell and stepped outside, her mind racing. The stranger was a courier, perhaps, but for whom? Vance, or someone higher up the chain? She returned to the Blue Boar, hoping to catch Vance before he left for the day. He was in the bar, his suit immaculate, but his eyes shadowed with fatigue. She approached, her pamphlets a convenient excuse. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I do hope you enjoyed the fête." That anonymous marmalade was quite a surprise, wasn't it? Vance's smile was tight, his fingers drumming on his notebook. "A fine entry, Miss Marple. Though I suspect it's just a local playing a prank using Hargreaves' name." "Perhaps," she said, her tone mild but her gaze sharp, though it tasted remarkably like his work. "You knew him well, I believe. Did he ever mention sharing his formula with anyone, a colleague, perhaps, or a company like Carter and Sons?" Vance's hand froze, and for a moment his composure slipped, revealing a flash of alarm. Carter and Sons. Never heard of them. Hargreaves was secretive, kept his work close. If someone's using his formula, they stole it. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind noted the lie. Vance knew Carter and Sons, or at least their name had struck a nerve. She left him with a pamphlet, her smile as gentle as ever, and walked home, the train ticket and Miss Hartnell's information heavy in her thoughts, at her cottage. She lit a fire and opened her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing the day's findings. Scarred stranger, met Vance, sent package to Carter and Sons. Return ticket to London. Vance denies Carter and Sons, alarmed beside each. She wrote, link. The stranger was a shadow, moving between Vance and the city, his satchel a key to the mystery. She thought of a case years ago when a courier in St. Mary Mead had carried stolen jewels for a seemingly respectable merchant, his guilt revealed by a dropped receipt. The stranger's package was no jewel, but its value was clear. Tomorrow, she would press Mrs. Finch further, probing the chalk dust and her fear. The notebook from the shed was safe, but its warning about Vance tied him to the stranger and Carter. And Sons was a new thread, one that led beyond the village. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her knitting untouched as the fire crackled. The stranger's shadow was lengthening, but shadows, she knew, always led back to their source. She would find it, patient and precise, until the mystery of Professor Hargreaves stood revealed. Chapter 9. The Housekeeper's Confession. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the scent of dew-soaked grass mingling with the faint smoke of chimney fires as the village awoke. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea steaming gently beside a plate of untouched scones, her mind wholly occupied with the threads of the mystery that had grown ever more tangled. The notebook from the shed, with its warning about LV and the intricate details of Professor Hargreaves' marmalade formula, had confirmed the stakes, a scientific triumph worth stealing. The scarred stranger's midnight visit, his package to Carter and Sons, and Leonard Vance's alarmed denial of knowing the company had tightened the web. But it was Mrs. Finch, the professor's housekeeper, whose chalk-dusted hem and fearful demeanour drew Miss Marple's focus today. The housekeeper's nervous glances at the fête and her connection to the shed suggested she held a key to the puzzle. And Miss Marple, with her knack for loosening tongues over tea, resolved to unravel it. She sent a note to Mrs. Finch, inviting her for a late morning chat under the guise of discussing the Women's Institute's upcoming meeting. The reply was prompt but terse, and at 10:30, Mrs. Finch appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, her wiry frame rigid, her eyes shadowed with unease. The orange stain on her apron was gone, but a faint smudge of chalk dust lingered on her sleeve, a detail Miss Marple noted as she ushered her guest into the drawing room. "How kind of you to come, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as the ticking of the mantel clock. "This business with Professor Hargreaves must be weighing heavily on you. Do sit, and let's have some tea." Mrs. Finch perched on the edge of an armchair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. "It's been a trial, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "The cottage feels empty without him, and all this talk of his marmalade, it's more than I can bear." Miss Marple poured tea, the delicate clink of china a counterpoint to the tension in the room. "I can only imagine," she said, passing a cup. "You were so close to his work, tidying the study, seeing his experiments. Did he ever share anything about his formula? It seems to have stirred quite a fuss." Mrs. Finch's cup trembled, and a drop of tea spilled onto her saucer. "He was private, ma'am, always locking his papers away, but he was proud of that. Marmalade said it was his legacy. Last week, he was agitated, kept saying someone wanted to steal it. Someone." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flicker of fear in Mrs. Finch's face. "Did he mention a name, perhaps? Or anything about a visitor from London, Mr. Vance, for instance?" Mrs. Finch's lips parted, then closed, her gaze dropping to her lap. "He didn't say names, not exactly, just city folk and greedy hands. I thought he was being fanciful, but then he was gone, and that jar was broken." Miss Marple nodded, offering a scone with a smile that invited trust. "It must have been a shock, finding the cottage in such a state. I hear you were at market that morning, but you mentioned voices at the door before you left. Could it have been Mr. Vance, or perhaps someone else, a man with a scar, maybe?" Mrs. Finch's hand froze on the scone, crumbling it into her lap. Her face paled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might bolt. "I didn't see who it was," she stammered. "Just heard the professor talking, and another voice, low-like. I was in a hurry, didn't think much of it." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing but relentless. "Though it's curious, isn't it, that anonymous jar at the fête, so like the professor's work, yet not in his hand. And then there's the shed, at Willow Cottage. Such an odd place for a tin box, don't you think? Mrs. Finch's eyes widened, and her breath caught. The shed, she whispered, her voice barely audible. How did you, Miss Marple? Leaned forward, her gaze kind but unyielding. I couldn't help noticing the chalk dust on your sleeve, my dear. The shed's walls are whitewashed, and I found a box there, locked tight. It made me wonder if you'd been looking for something or hiding it. The housekeeper's composure cracked, her hands trembling as she set down her cup. Tears welled in her eyes, and her voice broke as she spoke. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't mean no harm. It was the formula. I took a sample, just a page, for a company in London. They offered money, more than I'd ever seen, enough to leave this village and start fresh. I didn't steal the professor, I swear. I copied a page from his notebook, the one in the study, and sent it to them. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. Carter and Sons, perhaps? She asked softly. Mrs. Finch's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. How did you know I didn't tell no one? They wrote to me months ago, said they'd pay for any recipe the professor was working on. I thought it was just marmalade, nothing serious. But when he vanished, I got scared, thought maybe they'd done something to him. Miss Marple poured more tea, her movements calm as she processed the confession. And the tin box in the shed, did you hide it there? Mrs. Finch nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I panicked after he disappeared. I'd taken the page, but I didn't want it found on me, so I put it in the box and hid it in the shed. I meant to get it back, but then the police came, and I couldn't risk it. Miss Marple's mind raced, fitting the housekeeper's confession into the tapestry. Mrs. Finch had stolen a sample of the formula for Carter and Sons. The same company the scarred stranger had sent a package to. But her fear suggested she hadn't acted alone, nor hadn't expected the consequences. And this page, Miss Marple said, was it enough to recreate the marmalade we tasted at the fête? Mrs. Finch shook her head. I don't know, ma'am. It was just ratios and some chemical notes. I sent it before he vanished, but I didn't make that jar. I swear, I don't know who did. Miss Marple believed her. The housekeeper's guilt was real, but it was the guilt of greed, not violence. She patted Mrs. Finch's hand, her voice gentle. You've done right to tell me, my dear. But you must tell Constable Reed, too. The truth will help find the professor. Mrs. Finch nodded, wiping her eyes. I will, ma'am. I just want this over. As the housekeeper left, her steps heavy with relief and dread, Miss Marple sat back, her tea cold but her mind alight. Mrs. Finch's confession tied Carter and Sons to the formula, and the scarred stranger's package suggested a link to Vance. The anonymous jar at the fête was no prank but a calculated move, perhaps to test the formula's value or to taunt the village. She thought of the notebook in her drawer, its warning about LV. Now more ominous than ever, she walked to the village green, where the fête's stalls were being dismantled, the air still sweet with the scent of preserves. Mrs. Ban was there, overseeing the clean-up, and Miss Marple joined her, her basket a shield for her thoughts. Dolly, she said, have you heard anything more about that anonymous jar? Any whispers about who might have entered it? Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with gossip. Not a word, Jane, but everyone's talking. Some say it's a rival. Chemist, others think it's someone local playing a game. And Mr. Vance was asking about it this morning, wanted to know if the vicar had traced the sender. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Vance's interest was no surprise, but his persistence tightened the thread connecting him to the stranger and Carter and Sons. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and returned home, her notebook open before the fire. She wrote, Mrs. Finchstall formula, sample for Carter and Sons, hid page in Shed's tin box. Scarred stranger, packaged to same company. Vance asks about jar. Beside each, she added, conspiracy. She recalled a case years ago when a maid in St. Mary Mead had sold her employer's letters for profit. Her guilt betrayed by a trembling hand and a tearful confession. Mrs. Finch was no murderer, but her actions had set this mystery in motion. The scarred stranger, Vance, and Carter and Sons formed a triangle of greed, with Hargreaves at its center. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would confront Vance, probing his lies about the company. For now, she closed her notebook, her knitting untouched. As the fire cast long shadows, the housekeeper's confession had illuminated one corner of the mystery, but the stranger's shadow still loomed, and Miss Marple would follow it to the truth. Chapter 10. The Businessman's Bluff. The midday sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a warm, golden haze, its light filtering through the elms and dappling the cobblestone lanes with patterns of shadow and shine. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the glare, walked with her usual unhurried grace toward the Blue Boar Inn, her basket swinging lightly on her arm. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves' disappearance had grown sharper with each revelation. The notebook from the shed. Warning of LV. Mrs. Finch's tearful confession of stealing a formula sample for Carter and Sons. The scarred strangers packaged to the same company. And the anonymous jar of Hargreaves' finest at the fête, a bold display of the stolen recipe. Leonard Vance, the London businessman with his polished charm and veiled unease, was now at the heart of the web, his denials and furtive meetings suggesting a deeper role. Miss Marple, under the pretense of delivering more fate pamphlets, intended to test his composure, for she knew that men like Vance often betrayed themselves when pressed, their bluffs crumbling under the weight of truth. The inn was quiet, its barroom empty save for the faint clink of glasses as Mr. Higgs prepared for the lunch crowd. Vance sat alone at a corner table, his tailored suit as immaculate as ever, but his eyes were shadowed, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on a leather-bound notebook. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat before him, unusual for the hour, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for it. She approached, her pamphlets clutched like a shield, her smile as disarming as a summer breeze. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I've brought the final fate programs. Quite a success this year, don't you think?" That anonymous Marmalade was the talk of the village. Vance looked up, his smile quick but strained, like a mask slipping into place. "Miss Marple, how kind." Yes, the fate was charming. The Marmalade was a surprise, I'll grant you, though I suspect it's just a local's jest. Miss Marple settled into a chair uninvited, her manner as natural as if they were old acquaintances. "A jest, perhaps," she said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, though it tasted remarkably like Professor Hargreaves' work. "You discussed his formula with him, I believe. A lucrative prospect, you called it." Vance's fingers tightened on his glass, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face before he smoothed it away. "We spoke briefly, yes. A business opportunity. Gourmet preserves are a growing market. But Hargreaves was stubborn, wanted to keep his recipe private. I didn't press him." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "How? Curious, then, that his formula should appear at the fête, don't you think? and so soon after his disappearance. I wonder if someone, perhaps a colleague or a company like Carter and Sons, got hold of it. Vance's hand froze, the whiskey glass halfway to his lips. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flash of something, fear, perhaps, or calculation. Carter and Sons, he said, his voice too casual. Never heard of them. If someone's using Hargreaves' formula, they must have stolen it. Outright, I had nothing to do with it. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, her mind noting the lie. Mrs. Finch had confessed to sending a sample to Carter and Sons, and the scarred stranger's package to the same firm linked Vance to the scheme. She leaned forward, her tone as mild as ever. Of course, Mr. Vance. Though it's odd, isn't it, that you met a man, a scarred fellow, with a satchel, speaking of securing the deal. The village does talk, you know. Vance's smile vanished, his jaw clenching as he set down his glass with a thud. You're mistaken, Miss Marple, he said, his voice sharp. I meet many people in my line of work. That man was no one, a messenger, nothing more. You're seeing conspiracies where there are none. Miss Marple nodded, as if chastened, but her eyes gleamed. My mistake, I'm sure. We old ladies do get carried away with village gossip, though I did hear you were asking about the anonymous jar this morning. Quite a coincidence, don't you think? Vance stood abruptly, his notebook tucked under his arm. I have business in London, Miss Marple, if you'll excuse me. He strode out, his steps clipped, leaving the whiskey glass and a faint scent of cologne behind. Miss Marple remained seated, her mind racing. Vance's reaction, his alarm at Carter and Sons, his denial of the scarred stranger confirmed his involvement. He was no mere businessman, but a player in a calculated game, one that involved theft and perhaps worse. She rose, thanking Mr. Higgs, who had watched the exchange from the bar with a raised eyebrow. Touchy fellow, that Vance Higgs remarked, polishing a glass. Asked me this morning if anyone claimed that marmalade jar. Seemed mighty keen to know. Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. She stepped outside, the village green now quiet after the fate's bustle, and walked toward the post office, where Miss Hartnell might have more to share. The postmistress was sorting parcels, her sharp eyes lighting up at Miss Marple's arrival. Miss Marple, she said, leaning across the counter. Heard you were talking to Vance. He was here earlier, sending another telegram to London, something about delays and urgent delivery. Looked like he hadn't slept a wink. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Did he mention Carter and Sons again, by chance? Not by name, Miss Hartnell said, but the telegram was addressed to a London office. Same as that scarred fellow's package. I'd wager it's the same crowd. Miss Marple thanked her and walked home, her thoughts swirling like leaves in the breeze. Vance's telegrams, the stranger's package. Mrs. Finch's confessional pointed to Carter and Sons, a company eager for Hargreaves. Formula? The anonymous jar was a test, perhaps, to gauge its market value. But Vance's agitation suggested he hadn't expected it to surface so soon. Was he the mastermind or a pawn in a larger scheme? At her cottage, she lit a fire and opened her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing the day's findings. Vance denies Carter and Sons. Alarmed by scarred man, question. Asked about jar. Telegram urgent delivery, London. Beside each, she wrote, bluffing. She thought of a case years ago when a St. Mary Mead merchant had lied about his dealings with a smuggler, his nerves betraying him over a cup of tea. Whiskey and sharp exit were no different. His bluff, a thin veil over guilt. She recalled the notebook's warning, beware, LV, and the scarred stranger's satchel, heavy with purpose. The stranger was likely a courier hired by Vance or Carter and Sons, but his role in Hargreaves' disappearance remained unclear. Had he taken the professor, or merely the formula? And where was Hargreaves now hidden, or worse? Miss Marple closed her notebook, her knitting untouched as the fire cast flickering shadows. Tomorrow she would revisit Willow Cottage, perhaps, to find Constable Reed and share the notebook's contents. The shed's tin box, now empty, had held the key, but the professor's fate was still a shadow. Vance's bluff had cracked, and the scarred stranger's movements were a trail she would follow. The mystery was a chessboard, and Miss Marple was one move from checkmate. Her patience the key to the final play. Chapter 11. The hidden cellar. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village's winding lanes and bathing the rooftops in a soft amber glow. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat buttoned against the cooling air, walked toward Willow Cottage with a purposeful stride, her basket swinging lightly on her arm. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves' disappearance had tightened its grip on her mind. The notebook with its warning about LV, Mrs. Finch's confession of stealing a formula sample for Carter and Sons, the scarred stranger's package, and Leonard Vance's crumbling bluff had woven a complex tapestry. The anonymous jar at the fête, bearing the professor, Isséun, Mr. Covell, Marmalade, had been a taunt, and Vance's agitation suggested he was closer to the heart of the scheme than he admitted. A tip from Tom Bailey, whispered nervously at the grocer's shop that morning, now drew Miss Marple back to Willow Cottager. Mention of a cellar door the police had overlooked, hidden beneath a rug in the scullery. Her instincts told her it was no mere storage space, but a vault for secrets, and she intended to uncover them. The village was settling into its evening rhythm, with the clatter of teacups and the faint hum of gossip drifting from open windows. Willow Cottage stood silent, its ivy-clad walls a mute witness to the drama within. Constable Reed was absent, likely at the station filing reports, and the police tape had been removed, leaving the cottage unguarded. Miss Marple slipped through the garden gate, her eyes scanning the familiar path to the shed, where the chalk-dusted tin box had yielded the professor's notebook. But today her focus was the house itself, and the cellar Tom had described with a tremor in his voice, as if he feared what it might hold. She entered through the unlocked back door. A detail that nagged at her Hargreaves had been meticulous. Yet the door had been opened the day he vanished. The scullery was dim, its air heavy with the scent of soap and damp stone. Miss Marple knelt, her torch casting a narrow beam across the floor, and lifted the worn rug Tom had mentioned. Beneath it was a trapdoor, its edges flush with the stone, a rusty ring handle barely visible. She tugged gently, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Her heart quickened, but her resolve was steady. She had explored hidden corners before, in cases where truth lurked in the shadows. The stairs were steep, the air growing cooler and mustier as she descended. Her torch illuminated cobwebbed walls and a stone floor cluttered with crates and barrels, likely used for storing preserves or gardening supplies. But at the far end, behind a stack of crates, she saw a faint outliner door, half hidden by a tarp. She moved carefully, her steps silent, and pulled the tarp aside. The door was bolted, but not locked, and with a gentle push, it swung open to reveal a small chamber, its air thick with the tang of oranges and something sharper, like fear. There, slumped against the wall, was Professor Hargreaves alive, but bound and gagged, his white hair disheveled, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and exhaustion. His wrists were tied with coarse rope, and a strip of cloth muffled his voice. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her fingers deftly untying the gag as she whispered, "Professor, it's Miss Marple. You're safe now." Hargreaves gasped, his voice hoarse. "Miss Marple, thank God." It was Leonard Vance. He wanted my formula, said it was worth millions. When I refused to sell, he locked me here, said he'd force me to give it up. Miss Marple worked at the ropes, her mind racing. "And the formula? The notebook I found in the shed is that the original?" "Yes," Hargreaves said, wincing as the ropes loosened. "I hid it there before he came. Vance got a sample, though must have copied it from my study. That jar at the fête, it's mine, but not my doing." She helped him to his feet, noting his pallor but steady pulse. "And the scarred man, was he with Vance?" Hargreaves nodded. "A hired man, I think. Vance called him Cobb. He brought food, kept watch. They thought I'd break, but I wouldn't give them the full formula." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Cobb, the scarred stranger, had a name. She guided Hargreaves to the stairs, her torch lighting the way. "We must get you to safety, Professor. Constable Reed will need to hear this." They emerged into the evening light, a stark contrast to the cellar's gloom. Miss Marple settled Hargreaves in the kitchen, fetching a glass of water as she pieced together the revelation. Vance had orchestrated the kidnapping, using Cobb to guard the professor while passing off a stolen sample to Carter and Sons. The anonymous jar was a test, likely to prove the formula's value, but Hargreaves' survival changed everything. The notebook, safe in her drawer, was the key, and Vance's bluff was unraveling. She hurried to the village, leaving Hargreaves with a blanket and a promise to return with Reed. At the police station, she found the constable poring over reports, his face flushed with frustration. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, "what brings you here so late?" "Professor Hargreaves is alive," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "He's at Willow Cottage, in the kitchen. He was held in a hidden cellar, bound by Leonard Vance and a man named Cobb." Reed's jaw dropped, and he scrambled for his hat. "Alive? Good Lord, I'll fetch the sergeant." "You're sure it's Vance?" "Quite sure," Miss Marple said. "But we must act quickly. Vance is still in the village, and he may suspect the game is up." Reed rushed off, promising to secure the cottage and arrest Vance. Miss Marple returned home, her mind alight with the day's discovery. She opened her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing the breakthrough. Hargreaves alive, held in cellar by Vance and Cobb. Formula sample stolen, used for fate jar. Notebook safe. Beside each, she wrote, "Motive clear. Vance's greed had driven him to kidnapping, and Cobb was his enforcer. Their scheme hinging on the formula's value to Carter and Sons." She thought of a case years ago when a St. Mary Mead farmer had been locked in a barn over a land dispute, his captor betrayed by a careless footprint. Vance's mistake was bolder, his confidence in the cellar's secrecy his downfall. The anonymous jar, Mrs. Finch's stolen sample, and Cobb's package all pointed to a conspiracy. But Hargreaves' testimony would seal it as the clock struck 8. Miss Marple lit a fire, her knitting untouched. Tomorrow, she would ensure Vance faced justice, but for now, she savored the moment the hidden cellar had yielded its secret, and the professor was safe. The mystery was nearing its end. But one thread remained. Vance's next move. She would watch, patient and precise, until the final knot was untied. Chapter 12. The trap. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a deepening indigo, streaked with clouds that glowed faintly from the setting sun. The village hummed with its usual quiet rhythm, teacups clinking in cottages, the soft bleat of sheep. From distant fields, but beneath the calm, a current of anticipation ran through Miss Jane Marple's thoughts. The discovery of Professor Hargreaves, alive but bound in the hidden cellar of Willow Cottage, had shifted the mystery into sharp focus. Leonard Vance, with his polished charm and desperate ambition, had orchestrated the kidnapping, aided by the scarred stranger, now named Cobb. Mrs. Finch's confession of stealing a formula sample for Carter & Sons, the anonymous jar at the fête, and the notebook's warning about LV had woven a tight web of guilt around Vance. Yet he remained at large, his presence at the Blue Boar in a lingering threat. Miss Marple, her mind as keen as the evening breeze, resolved to set a trap, for she knew that men like Vance, when cornered, often made their fatal mistake. She sat in her drawing room, the fire casting a warm glow across her neat handwriting. In the open notebook, the professor, now safely in Constable Reed's care at the village station, had confirmed Vance's greed and Cobb's role as his enforcer. The notebook, secured in her desk, held the original formula, but Vance likely believed it was still hidden, his desperation to secure it a weakness Miss Marple intended to exploit. She penned a note to Reed, suggesting a plan, spread word that the formula had been found and would be revealed at the village hall the next evening, during a supposed meeting to discuss the fate's proceeds. The bait was simple but irresistible, and Vance, she suspected, would take it by morning. The village was abuzz with the rumor, carefully seeded by Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for gossip was unmatched. "Jane, it's working like a charm," she reported over tea, her eyes sparkling. "Everyone's talking about the formula being found. Mrs. Phipps swears it's in the vicar's safe, and Miss Hartnell says she heard it from the milkman. Vance was at the post office this morning, looking like he'd swallowed a lemon." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Excellent, Dolly. Let's hope Mr. Vance is curious enough to attend the meeting. The village hall is a fine stage for revelations." She spent the day preparing, her basket filled with pamphlets as a pretext for visiting the hall. There, she arranged with the vicar to keep the room dimly lit, with chairs arranged to funnel guests toward the front, where a table would hold a decoy-locked box, empty but convincing. Constable Reed, briefed on the plan, stationed himself discreetly near the back, his sergeant and a young officer hidden in the anteroom. Miss Marple, her shawl draped loosely, took a seat near the table, her knitting in hand to maintain her air of harmlessness. As dusk settled, villagers trickled into the hall, their chatter filled with speculation about the formula. Mrs. Finch, pale but composed, sat near the back, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Tom Bailey hovered by the door, his lanky frame tense, as if torn between fleeing and staying. The vicar bustled about, playing his part with earnest confusion, while Mrs. Bantry, stationed near the entrance, kept watch for Vance. At precisely 7, he appeared, his suit impeccable but his face drawn, his eyes darting to the locked box. On the table, Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her needles clicked steadily. She leaned toward Mrs. Bantry, whispering, "He's here, Dolly. Keep an eye on him." The vicar began the meeting, droning about fate, proceeds, and harvest plans. But the crowd's attention was on the box, its presence a silent promise. Vance sat near the front, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the table. Miss Marple, under the guise of adjusting her shawl, slipped the professor's notebook from her bag. Placing it beside the boxer's deliberate lure, she watched. Vance from the corner of her eye, noting the way his fingers twitched, his posture leaning forward as if drawn by a magnet. As the vicar paused, Miss Marple rose, her voice gentle but carrying. "Before we continue, I must mention a discovery. Professor Hargreaves' formula has been found, safe and sound. It's here, in this notebook, and will be returned to him tomorrow." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Vance's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Miss Marple resumed her seat. Her knitting resumed, but her senses were alert. The trap was set, and Vance, she knew, could not resist. As the meeting droned on, he shifted in his chair, his hand inching toward his pocket. When the vicar called a brief recess, the crowd milled about, and Vance seized his moment, slipping toward the table with a casualness to study to be genuine. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched him reach for the notebook, his fingers brushing its cover. Before he could grasp it, Constable Reed stepped forward, his voice firm. "Mr. Vance, I'll have to ask you to step away." Vance froze, his face palling. I was only looking," he stammered, but his hand lingered. Betraying his intent, Reed's hand closed on Vance's arm. "Looking, were you? We've got the professor's statement, sir. He says you locked him in that cellar, you and your man Cobb, and now you're after his notebook." The crowd gasped, and Mrs. Finch let out a stifled sob. Tom Bailey's eyes widened, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Vance's composure cracked, his voice rising. "This is nonsense. I'm a businessman, not a criminal. Hargreaves is lying. Where's your proof?" Miss Marple rose, her voice calm but cutting. "The proof, Mr. Vance, is in your actions. You couldn't resist the notebook, just as you couldn't resist the formula. You hired Cobb to watch the professor, and when he refused your offer, you took him prisoner. The jar at the fête, doing, I presume, to test the formula's worth with Carter and Sons." Vance's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the sergeant emerged from the anteroom, holding a satchel Cobb's seized from his lodgings that afternoon. Inside was a typed letter from Carter and Sons, offering payment for Hargreaves. Formula addressed to Vance. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Vance's shoulders slumped, his bluff shattered. "You underestimated St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling, "and it's Marmalade." Reed handcuffed Vance, who protested weakly as he was led away. The sergeant revealed that Cobb, tracked to a London boarding house, had confessed to acting as Vance's enforcer, guarding Hargreaves for a cut of the profits. Mrs. Finch, trembling, admitted her role in passing the sample, her guilt already known to Reed. Tom Bailey, shaken but relieved, confirmed he had seen Cobb near the cellar door but stayed silent out of fear. Miss Marple returned home, the notebook safe in her basket. She opened her own notebook, writing, "Vanscourt stealing notebook. Linked to Cobb and Carter and Sons. Cobb confessed. Mrs. Finch admitted theft. Tom witnessed Cobb. Beside each, she wrote, trapped." She recalled a case years ago when a thief in St. Mary Mead had been caught by a staged auction, his greed his undoing. Vance's ambition had been no different, his trap sprung by his own hand. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the pale pink shawl growing stitch by stitch. The mystery was nearly resolved, but Hargreaves' recovery and the formula's return awaited. For now, the trap had closed, and St. Mary Mead could rest until the next secret stirred. Chapter 13. The formula restored the morning light filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns across the cobblestone lanes and gilding the rooftops with a soft glow, the village, stirred by the dramatic events of the previous evening, hummed with a quiet excitement, its residents exchanging whispers over garden fences and teacups. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of Earl Grey and her knitting neatly folded, reflected on the trap that had ensnared Leonard Vance. His attempt to steal the notebook at the village hall, coupled with Professor Hargreaves' testimony and the scarred stranger, Cobb's confession, had unraveled the conspiracy. The formula, safe in the notebook locked in her drawer, was the key to restoring order, and Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the morning air, prepared to return it to its rightful owner. Willow Cottage, no longer a scene of mystery, but a place of quiet recovery, was her destination. Professor Hargreaves, shaken but unharmed, had been moved to the vicarage under Constable Reed's care, where he rested after his ordeal in the hidden cellar. Miss Marple donned her tweed coat, the notebook tucked securely in her basket, and set out, her steps steady along the familiar path. The village was settling back into its rhythm, but the air carried a lingering buzz. Mrs. Phipps at her window, Miss Hartnell at the post office, and Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for details, all part of the tapestry that had caught Vance and his scheme. The vicarage, the Reverend Clement welcomed her with a warm smile, his relief palpable. "Miss Marple, you've worked a miracle," he said, ushering her into the parlour where Hargreaves sat, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea in his trembling hands. His white hair was combed, but his eyes still held the shadow of captivity. "Professor," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as she placed the notebook on the table before him, "your formula is safe. I found it in the shed, as you intended. Vance and Cobb are in custody, and Mrs. Finch has confessed her part." Hargreaves' eyes welled with gratitude as he touched the notebook, its pages a testament to his life's work. "Miss Marple, I owe you more than I can say. You've saved not just my formula, but my life." Vance was relentless, thought he could break me, but I hid the notebook before he locked me away. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "It's merely a matter of observing human nature, Professor. Greed makes people careless, and Vance was no exception." She recounted the events briefly, her tone matter-of-fact. Mrs. Finch's theft of a formula sample for Carter and Sons, Cobb's role as Vance's enforcer, the anonymous jar at the fête as a test of the stolen sample's value, and the trap at the village hall that had caught Vance red-handed. Hargreaves listened, his face a mix of relief and indignation. "That jar," he said, his voice strengthening. "It was my formula, no doubt. Vance must have used the sample Mrs. Finch sent to Carter and Sons. They thought they could sell it. But without the notebook, they had only half the recipe, the stabilizers, the key, and that's here." He tapped the notebook, a faint smile breaking through. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the details. The stabilizer, a chemical secret that preserved the marmalade's flavor indefinitely, was what made Hargreaves' formula unique. Carter and Sons, with only a partial recipe, had produced a remarkable marmalade, but the full formula remained in the professor's hands. She thought of the photograph in his study, the woman with the basket of oranges, perhaps a muse for his work, though he hadn't spoken of her. "Will you continue your experiments, Professor?" she asked, "or has this ordeal soured you on marmalade?" Hargreaves chuckled, a spark returning to his eyes. "I'll not let Vance ruin it. I'll perfect it yet, Miss Marple, and perhaps share it with the village properly, this time, not through theft." She left him with a jar of his finest batch, a gift he pressed into her hands with thanks. As she walked back through the village, the green was quiet. The fate's stalls long gone. Mrs. Bantry waved from her garden, her voice carrying across the lane. "Jane, is it true? The professor's back, and Vance is locked up." "Quite true, Dolly," Miss Marple called, her basket swinging lightly. "The formula's restored, and St. Mary Mead can sleep soundly." At her cottage, she lit a fire and opened her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing the resolution. Hargreaves' safe notebook returned. Vance and Cobb arrested. Mrs. Finch confessed, remorseful, formula intact. Beside each, she wrote, "Restored." She recalled a case. Years ago, when a stolen painting had been returned to its artist, the thief caught by his own hubris at a village auction. Vance's greed had been his downfall, his ambition no match for the village's quiet vigilance. Miss Marple closed her notebook. Her knitting resumed as the fire crackled. The professor was safe, his formula secure, and the conspirators unmasked. Yet a single thread lingered: the woman in the photograph, a silent figure in Hargreaves' story. It was a minor mystery, one she might explore another day. For now, she savored the calm, her needles clicking in rhythm with the villagers' heartbeats. The formula was restored, and St. Mary Mead, for the moment, was at peace. Chapter 14. The quiet village. The late afternoon sun draped St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, its rays filtering through the ancient elms and casting a patchwork of light and shadow across the village green. The air was soft, scented with the last blooms of summer roses and the faint smoke of evening fires, as the village settled into its familiar rhythm. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pale pink shawl growing steadily in her lap. The mystery of Professor Hargreaves' disappearance had been resolved. The chemist was safe, his precious marmalade formula restored, and Leonard Vance, along with his accomplice Cobb, now faced justice in the hands of Constable Reed. Mrs. Finch's confession had closed the circle, her remorse a quiet counterpoint to the greed that had driven the scheme. Yet, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind lingered on the threads now neatly tied, and the village that had, once again, revealed its secrets to her patient gaze. The events of the past days had stirred St. Mary Mead like a gust through a still pond, but the ripples were fading. Professor Hargreaves, recovered from his ordeal in the hidden cellar, had returned to Willow Cottage, his study once more a haven of chemical vials and orange rinds. The notebook, with its intricate formula and warning about LV, was back in his possession, its pages a testament to his triumph over adversity. Miss Marple had visited him that morning, under the pretense of returning a borrowed book, and found him buoyed by gratitude and a renewed zeal for his work. "You've given me a second chance, Miss Marple," he had said, his eyes bright behind his spectacles. "I'll guard that formula better now, though I might share a jar or two with the village properly. Mind you, not through theft." She had smiled, accepting a jar of his finest marmalade, its amber glow a promise of the flavor that had sparked such turmoil. "A little generosity goes a long way, Professor," she replied. "St. Mary Mead has a way of appreciating such gestures." Now, as she sat by her fire, the jar rested on her table, a quiet trophy of the case. The village was resuming its routines. Children played by the duck pond, Mrs. Phipps watched from her window, and Miss Hartnell sorted letters with her usual sharp efficiency. Yet the memory of the fête, the anonymous jar, and the trap at the village hall lingered, a reminder that even the quietest places held secrets. Mrs. Bantry burst through the door, her hat slightly askew, her face alight with the thrill of victory. "Jane, you've done it again," she exclaimed, plopping into an armchair. Vance and that dreadful cob locked away, the professor back, and his marmalade saphets, the talk of the village. "You must tell me everything, every detail." Miss Marple's needles paused, her smile demure. "There's little to tell, Dolly. People are predictable, even when it comes to marmalade. Vance wanted wealth, Mrs. Finch wanted escape, and Cobb wanted his cut. They underestimated the village, that's all." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. "But how did you know, Jane? That cellar, the notebook, the trap it's like. You saw it all from the start." "Not quite," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "I simply watched and listened. A nervous boy, a stained apron, a businessman's lie, they're all clues, Dolly, if you know where to look. Human nature is the same everywhere, in St. Mary Mead or London." Double quotes, Mrs. Bantry sighed, sipping her tea. "You make it sound so simple, but what about that photograph in the professor's study? The woman with the oranges, did you ever find out who she was?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not yet, but some mysteries are best left to their owners. The professor will tell us in time, I expect." As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, recounting the villagers' reactions, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the photographer woman whose smile had hinted at a story untold. It was a minor thread, one she might tug another day, but for now, the larger tapestry was complete. She recalled a case years ago when a stolen locket had sparked a village feud, its resolution found not in the jewel but in the hearts it touched. Hargreaves' formula, like that locket, was more than an object. It was a spark that revealed greed, fear, and redemption. She opened her notebook, its pages filled with neat entries. Hargreaves' safe formula returned, Vance and Cobb arrested, Mrs. Finch remorseful, forgiven, Tom freed from fear. Beside each, she wrote, resolved. The village was quiet again, its secrets laid bare, but Miss Marple knew that peace was fleeting. St. Mary Mead, with its gossip and gardens, was a microcosm of the world, and new mysteries would bloom like roses in spring. As Mrs. Bantry left, promising to return with more gossip, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the fire crackling softly. The pale pink shawl grew, its stitches a mirror of her thoughts, steady, precise, and patient. She sipped her tea, the marmalade jar catching the firelight, and smiled. The quiet village held no secrets from her, not for long, and when the next puzzle arose, she would be ready, her eyes open, her needles poised, for in St. Mary Mead the truth was never far away. The end.